So today, what I'm going to talk about is some work I did about 5 years ago, shortly after I came into insurance. So um, uh, as Hick introduced, I my apologies if I got your name wrong. As Georgi always says, I'm very terrible at pronouncing names properly, so I don't mean any offense. My apologies. Um, I worked in quant finance for a long time, primarily in options and options derivatives. And as a result, my most of my statistical modeling experience was based on time series, which is very different to kind of your standard statistical modeling in terms of fitting regression models, because to get very technical, you don't have what's known as exchangeability. So, hike. Okay, my apologies. Um, um, you don't have what's called exchangeability. So that means that when you're with a standard data set, it doesn't really matter what order the rows come in. So if you swap two rows or whatever, that doesn't really change anything in terms of the model fit. But in time series model, order is paramount because you're trying to capture that whole thing. So an awful lot of your standard kind of linear models don't really work very well in that. And as a result, I hadn't an awful lot of experience with linear modeling or regression or anything like that until about 2013, 2014. So I moved over into insurance around 2014 and primarily in life. And I realized basically there was a whole bunch of areas, and one of the things I was going to need to learn how to do was how to price insurance. So how is insurance actually priced? Like, when you go online, and whether it's life insurance or health insurance or car insurance or whatever, just even from a consumer lines point of view, which is the insurance that you and I would buy, how do insurance companies come up with those quotes? Um, what's involved. So I thought this is brilliant. I kind of know how to fit a linear model because that's not very complicated, but I thought, okay, well, I'll learn how to fit GLMs, generalized linear models, where it's not necessarily a normal distribution. And that kind of led down a garden path. And I have GitHub repos up there that are working on this. And, it quickly led into model validation. So I kind of put a bit of work together. And what I'm going to talk about today is basically that. So it's how do we use GLMs with a bit of an introduction to what GLMs are without going too much detail. How are they done? How do we combine them? And then, how do we come up with some kind of technical price, at least, that, an insurance company can use to provide quotes to its customers. Now, it's not the full story because there's, as you can imagine, in a competitive marketplace, there's an awful lot more going on than just putting an economic value on a policy. So you've also got, like, market share issues and profitability you have to account for, and expenses, and there's a whole sorts of extra stuff. We're not really going to account for that too much. We're really just going to talk about what they call in insurance the technical price. So insurance is like a fascinating industry. It's got a terrible reputation, which is both entirely deserved and very, very unfair, which I know is a contradiction. But the reason why I say that is from an intellectual and a stats guy like me who loves technology and data and hard statistical problems that aren't easy to solve. Insurance is a treasure trove of those. There is just loads of problems that are very, very important, and also from a if you're socially conscious, insurance is really important to society. Like, we need insurance to spread risk. We need to be able to not have disasters wipe us out, as we're kind of seeing right now. Um, the spreading of risk is actually very important to create stability. But on the flip side of it, culturally, insurance is a nightmare. It's very, very reluctant to adopt technology, apart from in a few very specific areas. And culturally, it's notorious amongst anyone who deals in any kind of technological industry. Anyone dealing with insurance will tell you kind of similar horror stories of, like, where people just honestly don't believe you because they don't believe an industry could be that backward in the modern day, like paper-based stuff still, and insisting on it, and almost like absurdly proud of it. So I find insurance fascinating, and even this simple thing like how to calculate, let's say, a car insurance premium, you'll start to see how it's a reasonably complicated problem, but with important social consequences. So the book I'm basing this off is a really excellent one by a guy called Arthur Charpentier, that Computational Actuarial Science with R. It's a bit old. It reminds me of Numerical Recipes in C, for any of you who knows that classic text, in that the book is incredible, but ignore the code. The code is terrible in this, but there's a bunch of really, really good data sets, and the text and all the other stuff is very good. I just find the code entirely inscrutable, but it was written by a bunch of different people. in part. So that's where and you'll get most of the data sets. And the reason why I'm mentioning this is another big problem with insurance and data science, excuse me, is that data is hard to get. Good, high quality insurance data sets are actually hard to find in the public domain. There is a few of them, but we tend to know almost all of them. And that's a shame because insurance has been around for 300 years. But I mean, that's slowly getting better. But this particular book here is what I would consider to be one of the best in terms of data sets that you can handle on. There are others, especially for life and health, but this one is a very, very good place to start. So, I mean, as I mentioned, the insurance business in general is split kind of in two, with a third kind of squished in the middle. In terms of what we would think of it, there's the life insurance business, which is when you pay premiums yearly, and then when you die, you get a payout, and that goes to your descendants, or it pays for the cost of your funeral or whatever. And that's kind of how that was kind of one of the first real kind of insurance, how it came about and where actuarial work kind of came from. And then general insurance, which is pretty much everything else. So, your property insurance, your car insurance, your fire insurance, all the various product liability, professional indemnity, all the business interruption, which has become topical at the moment because of the pandemic. They are all kind of lumped together under general insurance. And then kind of straddling the two between is health insurance. Now, the reason why I say that is because they're both quite different in that life insurance policies tend to be very long term. So like a policy might last for a whole life. So you could take, I know of life insurance policies that are 80 years old, in that there is a union policy scheme in the UK. And I was doing some data exploration on it because we got it as part of a client when I was working as a consultant. And there was a policy that was 80 years old. And I thought that was a data entry error because that seemed preposterous. But no, it was genuine. There was a guy who worked for he was like a miner or some kind of trade. And he was now 90 years old or whatever, or 95. And he got a job when he was 15. And he'd had a policy active for 80 years. So whereas on the general side, most policies are a year long. Sometimes it's a bit different, and there can be, depending on there are some specialty risks like aerospace, for example, where you're insuring satellites, where things can last longer. But even then, it's generally just a question of you insure it before the launch and you're not on risk until the launch, and then it's a year after that. So in general, on the general side, policies are about a year long. And then you've kind of got health insurance in the middle, which is kind of like a halfway house in that it uses some of the inputs on the life side for health and morbidity and all that kind of stuff. But the policies tend to be much shorter. They're like a year or two or whatever. Okay. So, everyone kind of knows how insurance works. You pay your premium, and that can be, a one-off payment for a year, or it can be a yearly premium or a monthly premium, however it works. And then if some kind of event occurs which induces a loss, you receive a payout. So if you die, you get paid. If your car has a crash or you get sued or whatever it is, whatever the cover is, you receive a payout. So the big question we have to do is, how do we calculate this premium? How does a company know how much to charge? But kind of a more kind of fundamental question to that is, regardless of how they actually do it, because there's a joke in the industry which is not entirely wrong, which is pricing insurance is actually very, very simple. You just call up Lloyd's of London, the global marketplace, and then you add 20%, and that's how you price a policy. And an awful lot of places get away with doing it that way because they know they can just offload the risk with Lloyd's. They can take 20% in the middle and not do too much work. And that quite often happens. But kind of more importantly than that is, what are the types of things from a quantitative and a statistical point of view? What are those kind of things we need to think about in terms of calculating it? So I'm going to have a small bit. This is a reasonably technical talk because it's kind of a talk/workshop. All this code, by the way, is available. I'm using R for all of this, and it's all written in R Markdown with Reveal.js. So all of this is available on GitHub afterwards. If you want to see any of the code or the plots that were produced here, you're all more than welcome. And I have some links at the end that you may be of interest to. So, but I have a couple of equations as well. So, I mean, this is basically how we look at how companies price things, that we have the expectation of the loss. So given that we're going to write this policy on the book, how much do we expect it to cost us, like on an expectation basis? So we know that a lot of them are going to be zero because they're not going to have a claim, but a bunch of them are going to be really, really big, and like a small number, and then a bunch of them will be kind of attritional. So how do we do that? But then also it's not just about that. You've also got the expenses involved. You've got to hire people, and you've got to pay the regulator and run things with the regulator, and there's a whole lot of expenses around. It's a very regulated industry, so there's a lot involved in doing that as well. So you need to put in a loading there for your expenses because you want to make money on it, and then because you want to make money, you also want to put in a profit margin. So they all kind of combine together to get the price we quote. But what we're going to focus on is that first expectation, that expectation of the loss. So with life insurance, how they do it is there's monthly or annual premium. Then it's what's called a contingent annuity. So you're paying amount of money, the same amount of money, say every month or every year. And then if some contingency, like the person dies or long-term unemployed, or there's a whole bunch of different types of things, you get paid out. And then we use life tables, and there's a whole load of kind of statistical things that can tell us how to do that. And it's kind of like calculating a mortgage. It's basically a cash flow thing, and that's how you kind of model that out. For pricing general insurance, it's a bit different because we're typically 1-year policies, but not always. So what we want to do is estimate the loss cost of the policies, which is that expectation thing. And we kind of build it down to how do we do that. So we look at what's called frequency and severity modeling. So in insurance, the first thing people think of is the probability of having a claim, but that's not quite correct, because the claim, you can have multiple claims on a policy in general. I mean, it depends on the terms and conditions, but in general, you can have multiple claims on a policy. So say, for example, it's a car insurance claim. I have seen it I've dealt with car insurance books. I remember seeing one which was a relatively high risk portfolio. I remember one policy that had something like 20 claims on it in 1 year. Now, not all of them were the fault of the driver. So not all of them actually, in fact, most of them I think were zero, because they were other people or whatever. And we actually thought it was fraud, because that would be a sign of fraud sometimes, but it wasn't. It was just someone was an absolutely appalling driver with a bit of bad luck as well. So rather than model the probability of a claim, what we want to model is the claim rate. So it's like a Poisson model, if you think of it that way, or some kind of some counting process. So we want to estimate the count, the average count of claims over the given period of time. And then, given that we have a claim, we now want to kind of have the secondary effect of, given that we have a claim, how much is that claim going to cost us? So, and then essentially what we do is we have, an average cost per claim, let's call it, and then we have an average amount of claims, and then we multiply the two together, and that gives us our price, our kind of loss cost, as we'll call it. And as you might imagine, it makes a heavy use of GLMs, although that's a relatively new, the adoption of GLMs into general insurance is less than 20 years old. There was a piece of software called Emblem that came about, I think, in the late 90s or the early 2000s, that really kind of revolutionized the use of GLMs. I actually don't know what people used before that. I think it was kind of very kind of random heuristics. So the use of kind of, these kind of GLM models was a bit of a revolution within the actuarial circles about 20 years ago. And now they're pretty much the standard approach, but it's not as old as you would think. On the life side, things have been like life tables have been around for 150 years, I think. But like I said, the price is the expectation of the claim rate. So that we'll say for a standard kind of consumer policy, that might be, say, somewhere between 0.03 and 0.15, let's say. And then you have a claim size, and let's say that's, let's say the claim rate we're estimating for this policy is 0.1, and the estimated claim amount is, let's say, on average it costs us £10,000 or €10,000. Well, then it's 0.1 by 10,000, so you will quote €1,000 for the premium. And that's why you will hear, for example, in car insurance, if there's an awful lot of claims in car insurance, premium will go up, and that's because even on a loss costed basis, regardless of market forces or profitability, what will happen is the models will start inflating those expectations, because suddenly if a lot more people are claiming, for example, the first thing will go up, or if the claims are getting a lot more expensive, the second term will go up. So it's kind of the combination of the two. And like I said, if anyone has any questions about any of this, please pop them in the chat. I have two screens here, so I'm keeping an eye on the chat rate. So now we have to model the claim rate and the claim amount. So again, we use a GLM for that, and we use a Poisson distribution for the claim rate. We could use negative binomial as well. There's a few different ways we can go about using kind of, with the discrete distributions and estimating the parameters. But for the purposes of this exercise, we'll just use Poisson. And then for the claim amount, we use a gamma. And that would be kind of the standard way of doing it. You could use a log normal as well, and there's much fancier methods as well that can be used. We're going to stick with the basics for what we're talking about. But obviously we need policy and claim data. So that's where this book comes in, because I mainly found out about this book because I was looking for policy data to work off. And we have the frequency and severity data. So we have kind of two sets of data that we're going to need to combine, but there's a whole load of more data sets in the book. So that's fine. That's great. So the first thing we're going to do whenever we do any modeling thing is we look at the data, we load it up, make sure it's loaded up properly, and then we do some explorations on it. So we kind of look at the data and do some plots and very basic stuff, calculate some, means and standard deviations, maybe some rates or whatever. And we don't do very fast. So I'll go through this very quickly. A quick look at what the policy data looks like. So we can see we have, a policy ID, which is just an ID. Number doesn't really mean very much. It's a unique identifier. The number of claims that was on the policy, the exposure, which I'll get to in a sec, some stats about the car and the driver, what brand of car it was, whether it's diesel or gas, and what region and the population density of the region. Now, the reason why these are kind of important, for example, is that it doesn't really, in car insurance, for example, it doesn't really matter how good a driver you are. If you live in an area that's very densely populated, you would expect more accidents because you're going to be interacting with a lot more cars. So driving in a city, for example, you're more likely to have an accident than driving down the country roads where there's no cars at all. Because, more cars. And that's why, it's the age-old joke that most people have accidents within 3 miles of their home. And the reason for that is because that's where they do most of their driving. So that's not nearly as interesting a stat as it sounds on first blush. The driver age, it's a well-known statistic that young male drivers in particular are quite high risk, simply because they're not necessarily skilled and they're overconfident and they tend to drive too fast. So typically, and we will see this in the data, this is borne out. You'll see that there's the claim rate for the claim rate for young drivers is much higher than older drivers. Although we don't have gender in here, and this was pre. Gender equality pricing and stuff that is in the EU. I don't know if you have it in Georgia, but you're not allowed price discriminate on anything anymore in terms of anything. So you can't have gender-based pricing, which meant that women ended up paying more for car insurance, but less for life insurance, I think was how it worked out in the industry. So I don't think it actually shifted the gender spend at all. Because women live longer, so before this they would have had preferential pricing, whereas they would worse pricing because men would have worse pricing. Sorry. So okay, so we have that data. The exposure thing I need to say. So the exposure, when you look up the stats, the exposure is how long the policy was on risk for. So it's a function of a year. The idea is we 1 year policies. So what we want to do is to make sure that whenever we're looking at the count of the claims on a policy, we also want to make sure that the exposure is unit adjusted to 1 year, so that we're dealing with yearly frequencies. So we need to kind of account for that within the model. So very good. And you will actually find that in an awful lot of car insurance books, the exposure isn't a year because people roll on and roll off or get alternative quotes. And a lot of people will go for a year, but a lot of people will churn, or people will have a car accident and the car gets written off, so they cancel the policy. There's a lot of different issues like that as well. So it's not uncommon to have, quite a lot of 1 year exposures in your data set. So it's very important we account for that. So we're going to quickly look at this data here, and that just kind of make sure we've rolled it all in, and everything is pretty much as we'd expect it to be. There's integers where we'd expect to be integers, and so on and so forth. We also have the claim amounts. Now we have very little claim data on this. All we really have about the claim is the policy ID. So we can link it back to the policy data and we just have an amount, but beyond that, we don't really know anything. So whereas in in the real world, you would have some information on the claim, and you could probably use that as part of your modeling as well to, what different types of claims, and have maybe, different types of policies have different likelihoods of claim types and stuff like that. But for the moment, we don't have that. We're going to combine the table, so kind of just join them together and do some very simple. So we have a claim count from what got joined on, and then we have a claim. We already had a claim count in the original data. I'm just checking here to make sure. It's always good when you do this kind of data loading, do these basic simple sanity checks, make sure you haven't messed up. I actually very recently I ignored that, and I started using some data that I didn't do some proper due diligence on, because I'd done it before and I made one change and I just was too busy, and it completely bit me about 3 or 4 weeks later, where I ended up getting some really weird results. And of course, it was as a result of a long computation. So all that time got wasted. So always do your data validation and data checks and stuff like that. So we're going to do some very simple univariate exploration. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but basic bar plots. How many different claim counts do we have per policy? We have we're going to take out the 1 there because most of them have none, but I'd like to look at the 1, 2, 3, 4. So that's what we're doing there. You see, it's actually quite a similar pattern. So we expect the overall kind of frequency rate on this policy book to be relatively low, because we're not seeing very many claims. When we do a histogram of the claim amounts, we see it's very, very skewed. So we're probably going to have to, I've truncated that and looked at it where I just look at nothing beyond 25,000 units of currency. I'll call them euros, but I can't remember what it was. This data set it's from France in the 90s. Now, maybe they euro adjusted it. I'm not sure. This is a look at the exposure. Like you can see, the vast majority of the exposure is set at 1. And, there's a couple longer than that, which are kind of interesting, which you do get from time to time. Sometimes, excuse me, I'm just going to take some sips, because I'm going to be talking for an hour and a half. In rare cases, you do get exposures longer than a year, but the vast majority of them are 1 year or less. And that kind of is a sanity check for what we would have expected. Driver age, there's a pretty broad spread. You can actually see here there's drivers that are almost close to 100, which is kind of curious. And we even have a couple of cars that you can see this kind of, if you look very carefully here, or when you look at this in real life, you'll see that, there's a smattering of cars here, and then there's a couple of what seem to be vintage cars, which are way out here in outliers. And it's very handy to do this without really setting any axes, because it very quickly gives you a visual look at what your data looks like. So I like doing that even really without setting anything. We're going to look at the regions. You can see, the Centre and Ile-de-France and all them. So I think Centre is where Paris is. Ile-de-France is the area around Paris. So, these are all, we would expect this to kind of match some kind of, population counts or whatever. And we have the bivariate data exploration, where we're starting to look at 2 at once. So let's look at, driver ages by claim count. So if we box by claim count, where are all the drivers, and looking at a basic box plots. These are all handy, just looking at the regions. And this we've done this. If you look in my workbooks online, I have a car insurance GitHub. You'll see I do a lot more of that. And I'm actually in the process of redoing all of this. So if you keep an eye on that or subscribe to the GitHub, you'll probably start seeing commits come into that over the next few months as I just slowly do some extra stuff on it. Now, one key thing we do have to look about, which is very common in casualty lines, which is generally involving liability of some description, which a car insurance absolutely would be. Large losses are a big part of that book. What typically happens is you have a bunch of what you would call attritional claims within the industry. So these are your dents and your car write-offs and your bangs and your smashing windscreens and all that kind of stuff. And they might go anywhere from 5,000-10,000 up to maybe 25,000-30,000, or if it's a complete write-off and it's an expensive car, it could be 50, 60, 80 grand. But every so often, especially in a liability line, you will have huge losses. Now, I remember doing some work on one car insurance book where there was a single claim that was about 48 million. Now, it hadn't all been paid out, but that was where they were estimating the claim would be. Now, on that note, that another reason why insurance is so interesting is you don't really have all the data you need to do the job you want to do, because time is a big thing, and claims develop over time, and they develop into the future, which we don't know. And part of the problem is actually estimating how much claims are going to cost us. Like, we know they're there, ignoring the fact that there's claims out there that we don't know about, but even the ones we do know about, we don't necessarily know how much that claim is going to cost us, and we're not going to find out for another couple of years. Now, we've kind of ignored that for this problem. These are what are called fully developed claims, but that's another issue that we have to think about. And then every so often you get the truly monsters. So like I said, the 48 million. And one of the ways we're kind of working on this is, rather than trying estimate them, because they just kind of happen, and rather than trying to predict them, we just treat it with power law scaling. So we kind of say, look, we can't really do any kind of predictive modeling on this, at least as a first pass. So let's just assume that big losses are going to occur and try and estimate, the frequency severity on that dimension in terms of how power laws work. So we're going to do that as well. So if you can look here, this is like the power law scaling of the claim sizes. And you can see once you kind of get to this region here, around between 2 and around 3, you can actually start to see it does a pretty good job of forming a straight line. Now, it's quite noisy, mainly because of, errors. But when we trick it out and like here, for example, we just don't have a lot of data, which becomes a problem, because, the data gets very sparse. But, that's actually a pretty good linear fit for a log for a power law. So what we're going to do is, rather than try and predict high value claims, we're basically going to come up with a cutoff point, which is basically works out at about, I think it's about 20 grand. And everything above that is considered on a Pareto or a power law. And then we're not really going to do modeling of that. That's just going to be kind of like a very simple distribution fit. And we're just going to assume that they kind of happen. All policies are equally at risk for these kind of crazy claims. And everything, we're just going to add some kind of method to dealing with that, and then everything else is kind of back into our statistical model. So with power law, slope is the scaling factor alpha, and the alpha we've calculated for it. We have alpha is greater than 2, so we have a finite mean, so that's good. We can actually calculate an average of this distribution, and actually alpha is greater than 3 means we would have a finite variance. So we absolutely need a finite mean to be able to really do anything at all. If we don't have a finite mean, we're in trouble. We have to do something tricky. If it's greater than 3, we don't have a finite variance. And what that basically means is that you're just going to have the variance converges over time. This is something I actually discussed at the last data fest I attended in 2017. Like, what does infinite variance mean when variance doesn't converge? And what it basically means is, as you take more and more data in from the same probability distribution, the variance of that distribution does not converge. So what keeps happening is you've got your tails are too heavy, so you just keep getting these massive numbers that just completely throw off all your statistics. So it never really gets a chance to converge on a nice number. It just keeps jumping around the place because, it's doing its thing, and then one completely massive number comes in and blows all the numbers up, and, it just starts going away, and it just never really gets the chance to converge. So in our data, we definitely want finite mu, and when we do the calculation, we can see that we get 2.72. So we have a finite mean, but infinite variance. So that's something to bear in mind. So what we are, and it's good and bad. It's good in the sense of it kind of matches what we would have expected, because we have these very, very large losses in there. If you remember, we saw it back there. And the finite mean is good because at least we can calculate an average number. And with the scaling factor, we can get a sense of how often would we expect these really, really big losses. So, okay, so that's a basic thing. So now we're going to come up with our proposed approach. We're going to use the Poisson gamma models for the rate and the size, so frequency and severity, on the attritional loss, and that gives us the estimate of our attritional loss costs. And each policy then gets its own estimate. So, we're going to fit a Poisson for each policy and a gamma for each policy. Sorry, we're not going to fit it, but we're going to estimate the parameters of a Poisson distribution and the parameters of a gamma distribution for each policy. And each policy gets its own estimates then for them. And then for the catastrophic losses, those really, really large losses, we're going to use a power law distribution, estimate the rate of them, and just kind of come up with a flat charge that we're going to add on to every single policy to kind of cover those really, really large losses. And that's kind of how this is the first pass. Now, in reality, it's probably too strong an assumption to say that those big claims only occur randomly across the book. I imagine that in any book of policies, the really big claims are more likely than just chance to come from the more riskier drivers. So I think even if you condition on the fact that you're only looking at claims like claims made on a claims made basis, I think you would still have probably, certainly in car insurance, and this is why domain knowledge is so important. With car insurance, I would expect that, young male drivers are probably more likely to have big claims because they're going to do stupid things like, get drunk, drive, while hammered out of their heads on beer or whatever, and, fill the car with 3 or 4 other drunk people who think it's a good idea to get into the car with this guy. He's going to drive too fast, flip the car. And weirdly, because it's insurance, death isn't too bad. It's actually long-term disabled that's really, really expensive, because if the people flip the car and end up quadriplegic or paraplegic, you then have to cover their medical costs, and they're going to live for a long time because it's often not that mortality impairing. It gets and you get certainly a little bit, sociopathic when it comes to insurance, because that's the way these things cost. So weirdly enough, death is actually cheaper in a lot of cases than long-term disabled. Those are the ones, the ones where you have the truly, eye-watering losses are the ones where you only had, people didn't die, they just ended up very, very in need of an awful lot of medical care. So that's basically what we're going to do. We're going to calculate a technical price, which is that estimate of the loss cost, which is the attritional and then the catastrophic. So the attritional, like I said, is the product of the frequency and the severity model. Then we're adding on this catastrophic loading that we're going to calculate from the power law. And now we this isn't a perfect approach, but it's a starting point. And the reason why it's not a perfect approach is we may also want a bit in the middle. So insurance also has this concept of a large loss. So you have these catastrophic losses, which are the truly exceptional ones, but you could often get large losses as well, which would be things like, for example, a very expensive car being completely written off. So, rather than a 10 or 20 grand loss, it's an 80 or 100 or 130 or, those losses. So they're not quite catastrophic in that, no one died, no one was really badly hurt, but there was extensive property damage, or there was there was a lot of very bad things happen. And you might model them separately as well. So you might actually break that up into 3 pieces, where we want to model all our attritional claims, we want to model our large losses, and we model our catastrophic. But we're not going to do that because large losses aren't really in this data. And also the big one here is there's no real consideration of market realities. We're completely ignoring the fact that, insurance is a competitive business. So I can't just quote, a number and then come up with a profit and then expect to get that business if I am, 20 or 30 or 40% above everyone else in the market. All I'm really doing at that point is saying that I don't really want that business. And maybe I don't, because maybe it's too expensive. Maybe it's, the cost, the risk, I'm taking on too much risk and I'm not getting enough reward for it. But that's something to we're ignoring all the market competitor analysis, which is huge in consumer lines. Like a lot of the aggregator websites in Europe especially charge quite a bit of money now to get access to market data, so you can see what competitors typically quote and stuff like that. We're ignoring all of that. We're really focusing on just getting a technical number that we can stand over from a model point of view, and we're going to analyze that. Okay, so I'm going to start with generalized linear models. So because that's going to form the core of what we're trying to do here. So the basic concept is that when we're fitting a GLM, what we're trying to do is we're basically assuming that every data point is in the middle of a probability distribution, and around that probability distribution is some kind of variance, let's say. And what we're doing is we're fitting the mean. Now, the reason why I'm kind of making this point is this was a bit of a gotcha for me, because it's very, very easy to translate from linear model to normal distribution when we're simulating. What we would like to do is, once we produce these numbers, we want to simulate from them. So, but the problem is that when we move away from the normal, like things like the gamma or the Poisson, not so much, but a lot of these probability distributions are not parameterized by their mean. They're parameterized by other parameters. So when we have a mean of a distribution, if we want to generate from it, we often have to kind of do a bit of transformations, and it's a bit of thinking. So for the GLMs, what we do is we're going to get a mean and a dispersion parameter, which is like the variance, but it's a generalized concept of the variance. We're going to get a mean and a dispersion parameter, and we're somehow going to have to combine them into the standard parameters of whatever probability distribution we have. Now, it's not too bad for the Poisson, because for the Poisson, it's parameterized by its mean frequency, so that's okay. But the gamma isn't. So with the gamma, we're going to have to do some basic algebra and do some manipulations. And for me, sometimes it involves going onto Wikipedia and looking at the parameters and trying to figure out what is the mean, what's the variance, and literally going down with a pen and paper like I used to do back in school, and solve for two different terms and then plug them back in. So that there's a little bit of work in that, but we can do multiple forms of regression, and then on the claim rate, we're just going to predict a per policy Poisson rate. So we're assuming the underlying distribution is Poisson, which, as you know, for those of you who don't know it, there's a single. It's parameterized by a single value, the mean, and the variance is the same as the mean. So the standard deviation is the square root of it. So we only have one parameter to estimate, and our GLM is going to give us that number. So we're going to predict a per policy Poisson rate. So every single policy then will get a Poisson rate that we can simulate from. And we're going to first look at, just to kind of ground ourselves, what's the overall claim rate. So to calculate that, I'm conscious some of you might not be able to see that because of the coloring, but it's basically the sum of all the claims divided by the sum of all the exposures. And that gives us roughly the total number of claims we had and the total number of years that the policies were on risk. And that will give us a rough claim rate. And we see here it's 0.0697. So it's about 0.07. So what that means is that on average, if we didn't know anything else about the policy, what we're saying is that on average, for every 100 years that this policy is in force, we get about 7 claims on it. Okay. And that's typically for consumer lines. Those are the kind of rates that you would expect to see. For kind of consumer line type stuff, it's generally between somewhere at 0.01 and 0.2, depending on the risk and depending on the line of business and all sorts of different things. Okay, so we're now going to break it down. Now that we've done it, we can do the exact same exercise but split along our basic things, and we can see that, in general, there's a certain amount of variation between the different regions of France. And in some cases, we don't have a huge amount of data. So if we look at Limousin and Haute-Normandie, there's a certain amount of uncertainty there, which would suggest that we don't have a lot of data on it. So that's kind of, the values that we have there. We can look at the driver age, like I said before, and as you can see here, below the age of certainly even 25 is only really where it kind of, young drivers are just very, very expensive. They claim a lot. Look here, we don't have very many, but the ones we do have a claim rate of over 0.3. So that shows you why, young insurance for young drivers is so expensive, because the frequency is just so high and they just have so many claims. It kind of makes sense. I mean, when you think about it from a multiplicative point of view, if your claim rate is 0.1 and someone is at 0.3, that means the premium should be at least 3 times higher than a normal premium would be, purely because of the age. So that's kind of why you get to see that. And this is the one that really stood out for me when I saw that distribution. And then up here, you're starting to get into the region of higher levels. We're just now starting to get where the data is just we don't have very many drivers over the age of 80. So the data is, again, getting kind of unreliable out there. But we would probably expect, looking at it, that, the risk would go up, the frequency would climb there. And like I said, it's very nonlinear. So these things do tend to be quite nonlinear. So what we're going to do is, there's a couple of different ways we can do this, and I wanted to go really simple, and this is the way the insurance industry treated it. They just bin it. So you could come up with some kind of smooth regularization thing where you have a fit a spline and all that, and that is done, and there's generalized additive models do that and do that very well, but it's slow. It can take quite a while to fit these models, and there can be there's as you increase the complexity of the model, not only does computation time go up, but it gets harder to make sure your model is valid as well, which is something I'm not going to get into today. So for the simplicity's sake, I just binned it, and I kind of looked at the various breakpoints, come up with a couple of different categories, and kind of bin them. And we're going to use this in our model instead. And you can see, most of the policies are for drivers between the ages of, say, 25 and 27 and 75. Sorry. That's where most of our book is based. Okay, so we're going to fit a Poisson model. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with R, this is the R formula notation. So we're fitting the claim rate, the claim count, and we're fitting it with a zero intercept and gas, and we're just calculating the model off that. And we've got some model diagnostics. Basically, what this boils down to, the log of exposure is the offset thing I mentioned in that. What we want to do is to make sure that all these policies are on an annualized basis. So if something was only on force for like half a year and had a claim, that's the equivalent of 2 claims on a full year basis. So that's kind of what that offset is doing there. It's basically making sure that we're doing things on a unit frequency basis. And we've got some and then we look at the deviance here. For those of you who aren't familiar, deviance is kind of like the R squared. It's the lower the deviance, the better the model fit. And we often compare it to the null deviance. And the quick rule of thumb is for every degree of freedom that you add to a model, the deviance should go down by 1 unit of 1. So if there's predictive power in a variable, it should reduce the deviance of the model very significantly compared to the null model. I won't really get into it. We can see we do a quick split. So this is essentially, because it's just a single parameter model, this is effectively the equivalent of just calculating the claim rate for diesel cars and for regular cars with regular gasoline. And actually, they kind of match when we do that. But in this model, we can do fancier things. We can add in the driver age, and we see that gives us a better deviance, and we get some model coefficients. So we can start to see here, this is given as our underlying value, which we're going to exponentiate. So with the Poisson model, you take the logs. So to go back into the natural units, you exponentiate these estimates, which is also why in insurance, when you're looking at what are called rating factors, when we're calculating the price, once you fit your models and you're coming up with a quarter, risk rates are multiplicative rather than additive. And that's because we're using a linear model first where they add, but we're then exponentiating. So all those additions in the linear predictor become multipliers once we exponentiate. So we can see here that, regular gas is actually reduces the claim rate, whereas the driver age, young drivers increase it quite a bit. 22 to 26 increase it slightly. The bit in the middle is our reference point, so that doesn't get a parameter. We set between 27 and 42 as our kind of reference base rate, because that was where most of our book was. And we see the rest of them. And actually, strangely enough, the very old guys and women reduce the claim rate. It's actually kind of down a bit. So that's probably because just the way the data works. But that's kind of curious, but that's what the model says, which means maybe we should look into it later. But for the moment, we'll go with it. Now, I'm going to talk here about something that is what I like to call the secret weapon. Sorry, I don't like to call it. It comes from a guy called Andrew Gelman. He has a very, very good statistics blog, and I'm going to his book is in the references at the end, because it's a really, really good book on statistical modeling. He has a second edition of it about to come out where they've split the book in 2, and the first part of the book has been rewritten and is now called Regression and Other Stories, which is due out, I think, at the end of June. But he has a very thing, he calls it the secret weapon because it's really, really simple and no one ever talks about it. But what you do is you pick a categorical variable that's you reckon is important. You split the model down those categorical data, in that way. You fit the same model, obviously excluding that categorical, on those subsets of the data, and then you just plot the parameters together by the region. So, for example, we're going to split by region. We're going to fit the same frequency model by region, and then plot the parameters of each of the model by region, and just see what it looks like. So we can see here we've split by the different regions, and we've plotted like the intercept, changes a bit. There's a fair bit of variance within the car age, and we're even getting quite a bit of discrepancy. And the reason why this is very useful is because it's very, very simple to do. It doesn't take very long to do this at all. But you start to see the interactions as well, and it kind of it helps you give guidance to where you should be modeling. So if you've got a couple of different parameters that you think, like, especially if they're categorical, or you could bin them if it's a continuous, you could just go the binning route. You do your continuous splits and you fit the same model, and it starts to give you a guide of how those things start to interact, and it can help. You can see here now we've actually got kind of mad numbers here from Limousin and these particular ones, I think because the data is just incredibly sparse, so we're not really getting realistic values in that, and I believe I filter them out. Yeah, so we're just going to look at some of the ones where they're of interest and we have kind of much more reasonable. Now we could deal with that above by some form of regularization, but for the moment let's just ignore that and just like exclude them and look at what we're doing. I tend to use Bayesian hierarchical modeling as well for that, so that would be another way of dealing with that. You could just put your prior on it and that would naturally cause shrinkage. So, we've got a reasonable amount of spread actually between, even within the different regions, and we can see, mostly they're common, but there's a fair bit of uncertainty in terms of these error bars. Third age group. Sorry, I've just seen the question here. The third age group was statistic. Yes. Well, so it depends is the short answer. You could rearrange the groups that way. However, just because something isn't statistically significant doesn't mean you shouldn't use it in a model, especially for interactions that are coming later on. Sometimes what you will find is that while you don't necessarily have statistical significance within the group, it will interact later on in a way that is significant. And also, it generally just means that there's no necessary noise in there. But if you have domain knowledge that tells you, which is kind of what I based it on, was that claim rate thing. If you do have differences in terms of the groupings, I tend to still go with domain knowledge over statistical significance, because all statistical significance isn't nearly as powerful a tool as I think it is, because it basically only really works if the null hypothesis is true, and we generally know that the null hypothesis is not true. So there's this whole thing of statistical significance in the world now and whether or not it's relevant. It's a useful tool, but I think people over rely on it. But I mean, to be honest, this is kind of where the art of modeling comes in. If it's something that you didn't like and you wanted to change it, that would be something you would look at, for example, to say maybe I need to change it. But in my point of view, what I try to do is I try to go off domain knowledge much more than the modeling output directly, and try and think about it from that point of view. But that's an excellent question, and thank you for that. And by all means, keep them coming. So anyway, we're looking at all this. We're seeing a fair bit of variance and certainly a fair bit of uncertainty amongst the values, but generally they're giving us broadly similar. Although here you can see the driver age is kind of varying a good bit here. In fact, it goes from positive to negative down here, even though the realms of uncertainty probably not so much. So. Like I said, it's not necessarily something you use from your model, but it's a really good kind of very quick diagnostic for looking at how things work. We're going to look at the claim frequency. We're looking at a few more, and you can see maybe we get a bit more with the density, for example. We're getting a bit more difference between the parameters here. So there's definitely more variation in the density here. And then there was one more, I think. Yeah, even here, for example, car age, we can see in certain areas, some of them are subsumed in the others, but some of the error bars are reasonably tight in terms of the parameter. So, we'd have a lot more faith in those numbers than we would have for like something like this, for example, which is just a huge amount of uncertainty. To me, that tells me that we probably need to regularize the data to me, this screams like a hierarchical model. And build that in somehow. But like I said, I didn't really want to go too fancy. I just kind of wanted for me, I was just trying to learn the techniques rather than produce a very good model and figure out the infrastructure of how I go from basic data to the end. Okay, so we can at least have a reasonable stab at the frequency model. The claim size is generally harder. Because there's just a lot more irreducible noise in severity in general. In general, what you will find is, especially in insurance, is that while there's a fair amount of predictive power to your input variables on the frequency side, it's much less so. There's just a lot more inherent randomness in how much a claim is going to cost you. Now, again, that's not always true of all lines. In certain lines of insurance business, that wouldn't be the case at all, and you can probably put a very good stab on the severity. But for this kind of stuff, where you're generally in what are called consumer lines, personal lines like car insurance and home insurance, you generally have a lot more variability in the claims. So it's not as, you just don't have as much predictive power. So we've taken a log of the claim size and then plotted a histogram. So we see that we get this very large spike here down the middle. And what that is probably, I mean, it's that to me, when I would produce that plot, I would immediately start looking for domain knowledge for that. Is there some reason why most claims, like an awful large number of claims, seem to be within a relatively narrow range? And almost invariably that wouldn't be a mistake, but that's probably like that there's a certain amount of policies that for certain types of claims, they just have a standard settlement thing to reduce the costs of the claim. So the admin costs. So they know that most, apart from fraud, which we aren't looking at all and is huge in personal lines, but ignoring fraud, generally you get a lot of these attritional claims that are pretty much par for the course, that the main thing you want to do there is efficiency, because you're going to claim them. It's not worth fighting them in many cases, like they're genuine claims. So you just want to settle up, get them paid, get them assessed, do them as quickly as possible and reduce the cost of actually handling the claim, because that's a huge expense from a lot of insurance companies as well. Just the cost of actually claim administration is very, very expensive. So what they would probably do there, and what that would suggest to me is, and again, we don't have anything in the data beyond the documentation, so it doesn't really give us this. But that to me would suggest that there's a certain, for that claim amount, which is about, e to the power of about 7, which is about, I think it's about 10,000 or something like that. I can't quite remember. Or 8,000 or something. That would suggest to me that there's a certain amount that they just settle at and they just kind of pay that out, and most of the claims come in at there, and that's what they give the offer and they kind of claim away, and that just gets done. From a modeling point of view, though, it's going to be kind of tricky. So we're going to try where we're going to use like a linear model on the log and see how that works. But this is pretty terrible. So if you want to look there at the R squared, I always include this in, even though it's terrible, because this is kind of my, and I have rounded it off, you can't see it. The R squared on that model is 0.0017. So it's basically noise. So I think this is the worst fitting model I've ever built. Now, it's not quite as bad as it sounds, because I'm not really modeling properly for this, because this is a very skewed distribution. And when you fit with the linear model, you're kind of assuming a nice symmetric distribution with a mean, and it's not very skewed, and it doesn't have heavy tails. So it's not really surprising that using like the log and fitting a linear model on the log would give you such a bad model, because it's essentially a log normal. So certainly plotting that. But I always thought, with such a bad model, I had to kind of plot the predicted versus observed on that, and you can see it. This is why it's just a terrible model. I mean, the actual claim amount is pretty much in this narrow region, and we're predicting a whole range of values in here, and the whole thing is just a big mess. So this for I have a talk at some point in me that I plan to write, which is the 3 terrible models I've built and what I learned from them, and this is very much going to take pride of place on that. So let's maybe just take out and see what happens. Rather than accept this, we're just going to flog the dead horse. So we're going to look at all claims below 25,000 euros and fit this model, and we don't get any better. We get like an R squared of 0.0019 now, and an adjusted R squared of 0.001. So it's still terrible. So let's just stop flogging the dead horse. Pretty poor. And let's try fitting a gamma. Hopefully we'll do a bit better with that. So we try a gamma log on this, and there's a whole bunch of work that went into doing this, but basically this was kind of the model I settled on. So the claim amount is a gamma distribution with the gas power, the age of the car, and the category of the driver, and the interaction between the driver age and the power. Because one of the things I have heard in car insurance is that young people in powerful cars are a very bad combination, and they are way worse than a young person by itself or a powerful car by itself. It's when you have that interaction of the two, things are particularly bad. Okay. So again, we look at the power distribution. We just look through the various model distributions of them, and we come up with an expected versus actual. It's a little bit better. It's still a bit messy. We're kind of getting all this clumping, but what ideally, you want some kind of positive correlation in there, but it's not doing a great job. But there is a certain amount of discrimination in it. But like I say for all my models, but very much so in this one, it's probably best to just have low expectations for how much predictive power you're going to get for the claim amount. I think the best thing we can do is just accept that it's going to be fairly skewed. It's going to be fairly diffuse in terms of the randomness, as long as we can get a reasonable handle on the mean, and then we kind of just judge it on a distributional basis in terms of QQ plots and stuff like that, which I didn't go into here, but that's basically kind of how we treat that. And we just say that, certainly when we run the Monte Carlo simulation, there's going to be quite amount of variance, even within claim costs, just because of this random nature that we can't really deal with. Okay, so now we've built a model, okay? But how, we don't expect the claim size to be very good. The frequency is probably okay, but how do we actually assess the model? So we can go with like cross-validation and in sample, out sample and all that, and that's kind of the standard way to look at things, but I've never really liked that approach to model assessment, and I know it's pretty standardized now, but the way I want to assess models is to use simulation for it. So that's kind of what we're going to talk about. So, we can use the standard statistical things like deviance and, the various information claim criterion. But what I want to do is I want to take our model and let's say for the frequency side, we're going to simulate the frequency model. So we're going to take, for every policy, we're going to create a whole bunch of draws from a Poisson distribution. And then we're going to do that a bunch of different times, and then just see does what we simulate match roughly what we observed. Now, on an individual basis, that's not going to do very well because it's a very, very low frequency count, so you're just going to have an awful lot of zeros, so it's harder to assess from that point of view. But what we can do is assess the model in aggregate. So rather than try and get individuals right, we just want to see in general, and then for subsets of the data, are we doing a reasonable job at assessing total claims? So, for example, if I have a book of 10,000 policies and I run my model on them for the frequency model, and then I simulate from all of them and I add them all up on a per policy basis, does the distribution I get for each of my simulations, so let's say I have 1,000 policies and I run 100,000 simulations. If for each of those 100,000 simulations I add up all the observed claims for each policy, I will now get a distribution of 100,000 claim counts. And what I would like to see is, does that distribution of claim counts match the observed amount within that group of policies? Because we had, say, 1,000 policies, we would have observed some claims on this. This is in the training data, but we can also do it with our test data. On aggregate, are we kind of in the right ballpark? So we won't necessarily be the same policies that are claiming, and in most cases it won't. But in general, are we kind of in the right ballpark? And that's the only way we can really assess this, because we're dealing with such like low frequency rates. In the low frequency world, it's we can only really evaluate things on a statistical basis because things are very random. So there's a very fine line between, it's very random whether a policy has a claim or not in many cases, and it can be just pure bad luck. So we can't really judge individual policies. We kind of have to judge it at the aggregate level. So that's what we're going to do. And in terms of the severity model, because it's such a skewed distribution, the actual versus the observed is a bit inappropriate because, it's so skewed. There's a very fine line between something, when you've got a big, long skewed distribution, the amount of probability mass between, a relatively small change in the probability can mean a very, very big difference in the severity. So actual versus observed isn't necessarily very proper, and that was also why we saw such bad plots earlier. So we're going to need to do something else. So for claim size assessment, we're going to do a per claim gamma parameters, and then we're going to calculate the quantile for the claim amount, and then check that against a uniform distribution. So if we've kind of got the gamma distribution correct, it's kind of like a QQ plot. For that particular policy, we know roughly where the observed value came in on the QQ plot, and we calculate that cumulative probability. And if we've done a good job of fitting our distribution, we should be getting a pretty uniform distribution of percentiles for that data. And that means that we've essentially calibrated the probability distribution. So even though we're not doing a very good job at actually predicting actual values, we've done a reasonably good job of predicting the probability distribution that's generating those values. Now, we know in reality there is no underlying probability distribution for it, but at least from a statistical point of view, we're doing a reasonable good job. So that's kind of how we're going to assess our claim size. And we're just going to simulate the claim counts. So, and then we're going to do observed versus predicted. So we're going to take from our data set, the first thing we'll do is in sample and out sample. So we have our training data, or our training set. So, there was claims observed within that training set. We'll take a sample of that and we'll see, okay, well, from the outputs of our model, how good are we at assessing that? So this is what we've done here. So I've taken 20 subsets of the data, and I've just with a claim count of those subsets. So this is kind of like cross-validation. And this is the observed, the red vertical line is the observed value, and the histogram is the simulation. So I think there's either 500 or 1,000 simulations in this purely for computational speed. And basically what we want to make sure is that in general, this red line is falling somewhere within this, belt, this histogram. Now, we don't expect it to be in the middle because, probability realizations don't realize in the mean, they realize within the distribution. In fact, it's virtually impossible. And from a mathematical point of view, they will never come out at the mean. And that's a statistical thing. But what we would kind of expect is to see, it's roughly falling within the middle. What we don't really want is a red line to be way over here or way over here, because that would suggest we're doing things that are skewed. So we've, cumulative probabilities. So, we've a relatively small full pound. The other thing we could do then is we could do this a lot more times. So if we did this, say, 1,000 times, and then, like I said, we come up with an empirical CDF for this distribution and figure out what does the observed value fall on that probability distribution and turn that into a number. And then we would get basically a number of those uniform numbers, and it should be uniform between 0 and 1. And that's a way of assessing the model. So, it's not doing too bad a job, actually. We're kind of capturing the range as well, because we're not just kind of hitting the middle. We have a couple at the ends on both sides as well. So that's kind of good. So it's suggesting our model is reasonably predictable, but it's also somewhat unbiased. Now, there's a fair bit of range down there. If you can see, the range is going from 160 to 240. So there's quite a bit of variance in there, which we would expect. But, it's not perfect. For the GLM fit, how are we going to do that? So, like I said, this goes back to the problem we mentioned before, that now we want to simulate from the gamma, but the gamma is parameterized by a scale and a rate parameter, but we get a mean and a dispersion from our GLM. So we're going to have to basically convert into that. So, I mean, basically to recover alpha and beta, I essentially went to Wikipedia. And the reason why I'm saying that is because that's what I ended up having to do when I start using probability distributions that I'm not very, very familiar with. I basically go to Wikipedia. All the details are on the right-hand side, and it generally gives you the mean and the variance in terms of the standard parameters of the probability distribution, and that does a pretty good job. And then I literally get my pen and paper out and go, okay, well, I've got mean and sigma. How do I turn it into alpha and beta? So that's what we need. So we've got a bit of code in there that will take them out and do those calculations. Then we can plug them into the gamma and see how we do. So we're adding in, we're going to add in all that. I'll skip this on because I'm conscious of time. So, we have our simple frequency and severity. We're going to simulate our claim counts, and then we're going to, multiply to calculate the simulated loss count. So once we have, like I said, we're going to simulate, we're going to estimate, and then we're going to kind of compare the two. So we're going to simulate the claim counts from the claim rate. We're going to simulate the claim size from the prediction, and we're going to multiply both for our loss calculation. And the claim size model assessment gives us this, so we can see it's not. The claim size model is definitely lacking even from a distributional point of view, because we have this big clump around between 0.5 and 0.6. I'd rather have something kind of uniform that goes right down the middle. So this isn't the best model. It certainly means that we need to do work on this, because I certainly wouldn't be in any way happy to consider this a uniform distribution. And it suggests there's some structural things in our model that our model isn't capturing that we need to. So certainly the model needs improvement from that point of view. And a QQ plot is the alternative, and this should just be a straight line, and it isn't in terms of probability ordering. So this is again kind of another way of looking at this. So we definitely need to improve, even on a distributional point of view. We need to improve our claim model, but that's okay. I mean, no models are perfect. I'm not trying to show you a perfect model here. I'm just trying to show you how I learned how to fit GLMs and how you kind of go about modeling, because the dirty secret of this job is that models don't work, and it's much more important to know how they're wrong and how they failed, and is that okay? And if it is okay, like, what is the failed state, and how do we work around it? Or do we just know to ignore it? Or is that something we now need to focus on to improve in further iterations of the model? So, okay, so we've kind of got all our building points. So what we're going to do now is we're kind of going to take it to the final step. So we're going to build a premium quarter. So we're going to take these input models, and what we're going to create is a function. I'm not going to show you the code or anything like that. It's all done in R. But we're going to basically take the fits of the models that then creates a function that will take policy information in and produce premium quotes on the way out. And why that is useful is what we can do then is on our in-sample and our out-of-sample data set, if we know what the claim costs were, we can calculate, like, how did this book perform in a simulation basis. So if we quoted a whole load of data, and let's just assume we write all the business, so we're ignoring all the competition here, we're just trying to assess it from a loss cost point of view. What we want to see is, did the premium cover the cost of the claims? Because if it didn't, then we have premium inadequacy, and we're going to lose money, right? But at least if we can cover on an aggregated basis, which is how insurance companies work, can the premium of the many pay for the losses of the few? And that's basically what we're going to simulate. So we're going to, for the purposes of this model, we're going to remove drivers older than 75 years, because they're doing some weird things at the high end, and I didn't really want to deal with that. And insurance companies do this all the time. They will just decide that there's market segments they don't really want, and they'll generally, what they'll do is they'll just charge like a ridiculous multiple of the market rate, so that they effectively don't get that business. And we're also going to remove cars older than 20 years. In the real world, again, if we were, like, from a practical point of view, if this was something we decided to do, we would probably need to build separate models for those subsets of the data that we don't have. So our total data set, after we filtered out, the older drivers and the older cars, we now have just under 400,000 policies. So that's a pretty chunky data set. We're going to do our train test split. So we're going to take all that out. So we're going to take 100,000 policies for the test and take them out. Now, we could have done that earlier as well. We probably should have, to be honest, at the very start. I'm just kind of talking about it now. So we're essentially going to fit our model on about 300,000 columns, 300,000 rows, and then we're going to test on about 100,000. And that gives us our in-sample and our out-of-sample. We're fitting our claim rates. We've gone through all this. Our final claim rate model, we can see up there. There's an interaction in it just to see how that works. We're not going to get too fancy with it. And then, we'll use our claim rate model that we did as before. And now this is on the sample data. And this is we'll do in this, we build to our model. And, everything seems to be right. The claim count seems pretty decent in terms of where we're coming in on the test set data. And what about claim size? That's very noisy. So we're just going to assume an average claim size and use this for claim prediction. So rather than using the gamma distribution for the first iteration, we're just going to assume an average amount of claim. Basically looking at, we're not going to worry too much about the dispersion for that, because we're kind of focusing on the frequency right now. We calculate our large loss charge, which, like I said, we've got the scaling factor, and we're using that to estimate the mean of the distribution, which is about 60,000. And the large claim proportion, how many of these policies actually have a large claim? We have this. We multiply them two together, so we're going to have a large loss charge of about 29. So what we've done there is we've figured what proportion of our book has a large claim, and then given that it is a large claim, what's the average amount? And we can do that because we have a finite mean. If we didn't have that, I mentioned it earlier, if we don't have a finite mean, you have to kind of start to truncate it. So what you do is you put a finite value. You say, we can't have a claim larger than 1 billion, let's say, and you just truncate it. And because it's a truncated distribution, that reduces the heaviness of the tail, and it means we can now calculate a mean. And that's typically how insurance companies handle those kind of really large losses. They tend to put very high limits on policies that makes the maths tractable. So you will actually find especially for like large corporate insurance and stuff, you don't have unlimited liability on insurance policies. You will have limits, but that limit might be like 5 billion, or 10 billion. There can be really, really high limits on this. Okay, so we now have a premium quota function. So we've fitted our frequency and severity models, and now we're producing a table. So we have a policy ID that's coming in. We're calculating an expected price from the frequency and severity model. We're adding the same large loss charge for all of these, and like I said, we'll probably get better with this later on. But this gives us what we call our risk premium, which is 163. So it's the sum of these two, and that is the loss cost of the policy. But we don't quote that. We're going to quote a multiple of that because we want to build in our profit margin and our expense ratio. So I think it's a 40% charge that we're throwing on top of that. And the reason why we're quoting so high, or 30 or 40, is that typically for these kind of large consumer line businesses, the expense ratio is between 20 and 25%. So if you think of all the premium you take in, which is basically the sales of an insurance company, about 20 to 25 of that for commercial lines business will go on expenses and things like brokerage fees and all that kind of stuff. In some cases it's higher, and some business can be very, very, very high cost of doing business. But for this case, we're just going to assume. So what this means is we're building in a 30% premium here, and we should see that reflected in the data. So we built our premium quota, and we're going to assess the pricing. So how well do we do? So like I said, we're going to test run the assessment method. We've got the claim rate, the claim size, and the loss cost. And this is where we're getting out. So the in sample for claim counts. So on the claim counts, we're kind of in the ballpark for the in sample, but we only used 100,000 policies purely for computational speed. So I randomly selected 100,000 of the in sample data, the 300,000 that we built it on, and we're looking at, how well does it do? So that seems to be okay. What about for loss cost versus observed? So we can see that we simulated a loss cost of about between 5.4 and 5.8 million, and our estimated loss cost was about here. So we're actually a little bit low. So but that's that's kind of okay, and we would expect that. That's kind of okay. But the thing we really care about is the outer sample. Now, again, for speed, I only use 50,000 policies, because when I'm preparing this presentation, you're changing things a lot and you're rerunning it. So, typically what I'll do is I'll just take samples because it conveys the point. So we're fitting in there. That's the simulation value. And outer sample, we're kind of getting the same thing, but it's flipped over to the other side. So it's possible there our loss costs are a little bit low compared to what we'd expect, but it's in the meat of the thing, so we're probably okay. But we should do this a lot more often. For now, like I said before, we're going to bring the gamma distribution back in. So do you remember I said for the first pass we were just going to use a fixed amount? Now we're going to add in variable costs, so we're going to use that gamma distribution. And what we expect to see is that the uncertainty spreads. And that's a very important part of this, because one of the reasons why I always want to simulate is you want to capture that uncertainty as well. And that's like Bayesian stats is big on this. But it's not just a matter of coming up with point estimates, especially in skewed distributions like we often deal with in insurance. We also kind of want to see how off are we, and how much uncertainty is there, and how are we looking at in terms of where things could be? Because like I said, once you get into like a skewed distribution out here, I don't know if you can see my mouse, so I'll assume not. But once you start to get along skew, small shifts in probability can lead to big amounts on the x-axis. Because you start going into this big long tail. So it could a small shift in probability could double the amount, which isn't much in terms of the randomness. It's just a question of whether you get lucky or unlucky, but that has a huge economic impact. So you need to kind of account for that in your models. Out of sample, we're kind of in the ballpark. I mean, a lot more work is needed. I'm kind of putting them all on together there just to see how they work. And we're just going to assess the attritional pricing. So rather than also including the loading for the large losses, I want to just look at attritional. So what's the premium claimed against the simulated loss cost? So we can start doing that, because what we would like to be able to do is cut up our, we've built all these big simulations, but now let's look at like the subsets of them. So if I'm going to put one thing in and then another thing, and let's look at the subsets and start to see, okay, in general, we're doing a pretty good job of, on average, capturing everything. But it's the small sub-segments of the market, especially when you're dealing with very large losses, they're the ones that can kill you. So, we want to start slicing and dicing the data we've got. So let's start maybe, okay, well, in general, if we're doing okay, how are we doing for a certain age category, or in terms of the loss cost, or in terms of the frequency rate? So we want to start looking at assessing our model from those points of view, because that tells us then where we need to if we need to improve our model, it gives us directions on how to improve it. For assessing the large loss costs, in sample prediction of large losses versus the observed. So again, we took all our large losses in our model. What did we simulate versus what did we observe? We're not actually doing too bad there. Out of sample, not quite as good. We have a couple of really large simulated losses up here, as you can see, but they are not beyond the realms of possibility. We just didn't observe them in the real world. We should certainly be accounting for them in our business planning, because just again, because there's so much randomness involved in insurance, the big losses can be just pure chance. There's a lot of one of the very a common pastime in the pub and stuff in London is people to talk about their famous losses, and some of them are just purely nonsense in terms of just how bad luck. I mean, but this bad luck comes with a very, very severe cost, so you have to account for it when you're modeling it. So just because it didn't happen doesn't mean it's not a risk. Okay, so that's pretty much kind of where we had got to, but there's loads more we can do about this. So I want to talk very briefly about it. I see I'm kind of coming into the end of time, so I'm actually okay with that. What else can we do with this? So there's loads of problems with this model, like loads of them. Like I said, I was just learning GLMs, but there's quite a bit of instruction. And one thing I always like simple models, certainly from an explanatory point of view, but even from a practical point of view, because when you're using them in the real world, your simple models give you a very good benchmark to compare against for your complicated models. And when the cost of getting a model wrong is very, very high, it's very important to understand how your model works. Now, and that's why, for example, I don't use deep learning or a lot of these, and I know there's been talks about explainable AI and stuff that I'm going to start looking at soon. But also in this world, like when you're dealing with pricing, you're also dealing with regulators. And one of the things they're getting very, very concerned about right now is black box algorithms. So explainability and reproducibility is becoming very, very important to them, because they're very concerned about disadvantageous pricing and stuff like that. And things like cost optimization and stuff, which I won't get into. So they're very, very worried about that kind of stuff. So they like things that are comfortable. So even if you don't necessarily use it in practice, you still need these kind of very simple approaches just to match a benchmark for your own models that you would use later on. So I've used very simplistic distribution. I haven't used any over dispersed. So I would probably look at an over dispersed, or one of them I've kind of moved on from using a Poisson. I tend to use negative binomial a lot, because that gives us both the mean and the dispersion. So I tend to find that negative binomial actually fits better in a lot of cases than a Poisson does. We need a lot more validation and testing. Like I haven't really done there is that thing I mentioned before, like the equivalent of the secret weapon, where we take subsets of our data and we do slice and dice and then compare by different. So like, we could do the claim frequency by driver age and see in general when we have, does the distribution for those policies, how do we look, and are we getting systematic bias in there, or are we having that? A lot more validation testing, and the claim size model, like I said, leads a huge amount of work because we've got I don't use Stata at all. Sorry, I use pretty much R for everything. I've used Python a bit and I've used Julia a bit, but I generally find with my workflow, I use R, I use Docker, I use GitHub, I use Makefiles. I have a fairly decent reproducible research pipeline that kind of captures all of this, and I tend to be much more of a statistical modeler rather than a machine learning and AI. So I've never really needed to use Python or Spark or anything like that, and R is where I'm most comfortable. So that's typically what I will use for most of this. And all of this has been written in R. Yeah, but I mean, I'm not saying that it's better than Python. I'm certain I've no interest in the language wars. I know a couple of really, really good people whose work I think is amazing, and they do all their work in Python. And I know a couple of people who are doing in Julia, although Julia is a bit more computer science focused. I don't know how many stats people they have. The main reason I stick with R is because I use stats a lot, and it's really easy to mess up statistics. Statistical packages, and their errors can be very hard to spot. And a lot of the stuff I tend to use is like old, well tried and tested packages, certainly on the statistical modeling side. So I just tend to use them. I haven't used Stata, but I do know a few people that do. And I can't help you with that, I'm afraid. I don't really use it. I tend to use open source for almost everything. For loads of there's loads of future things I want to do. I'd like to look at like the large loss and catastrophic loss assessment. Like I said, I'm not particularly happy with the assumption there that it's just random and that we can't predict. There's no predictive power whatsoever for large losses. Like I said, I have a funny feeling large losses might be focused maybe on younger drivers or higher risk, and it's not just because they have a higher risk of having a claim. I think my gut feeling is there is risk assessment to be captured in that, and certainly from looking at that uniform plot, there's definitely something there the model isn't capturing, because there's no way we should get that big hump around the 50 to 60 mark. I want to start using Bayes on this. Like this is something I did before. I use Bayesian regression a lot more often now with rStanArm. StanGLM does it. There's also a really good package called BRMS. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Bayesian world, I highly recommend you look at it. Some of it is incredibly powerful. The linear models themselves can be improved, like generalized additive models. I discretized the driver age there, which is basically throwing away data, because you have a lot of information there in that continuous distribution. So discretizing it is throwing away that to a certain extent. It would be nicer to have some kind of smooth spline. And there's a whole bunch of extra stuff we could do on the neural nets. We could build some kind of neural net on the frequency model and compare them, and certainly use boosting and all that kind of stuff. There's a whole load of very good models now that have been built into XGBoost, I think, that can be used on the frequency side. And there's a thing called the Tweedy distribution, which kind of combines the frequency and severity. So it's basically a distribution that it's called the compound Poisson gamma. So it's got a Poisson distribution. So there's a big zero, there's a big zero thing. And then when there is a positive claim, you have a gamma distribution for every Poisson realization. So it's kind of this mixture model of a multiple gamma, like an addition of gammas along with a Poisson. So, and that's called the Tweedy distribution. So you can use that when you don't have, when you've got aggregated data, because data quality is often a problem in insurance as well. And it would be interesting just to do that and see how it looks. For anyone who's interested in this kind of stuff, and like I said, I think insurance is fascinating. There's loads of really hard problems that are need work on. It gets a very bad rep. These are books I can highly recommend. Like I said, all these notes will be available online afterwards, and they're pretty much up there now, I think, if you go to my GitHub repo, which I'm going to show you in a sec. This the last book there, Data Analysis Using Regression and Multi-Level Hierarchical Models. A second edition for that is about to come out, and he split it into two. So he's split because the book was essentially split in two, and the first part was all about just regression theory, which is incredible. It's the book how I used to read about regression back in the day, which I didn't expect because, like I said, it's kind of hidden in the title. So it's called Regression and Other Stories, and it uses Stan and Bayesian stats all the time. I haven't had a chance to look at it yet because it hasn't been pre-released or anything. But from what I've heard of the contents and the pre-release reviews, it's very, very good. I highly recommend that. Here's a couple of things for functional code because I used functional code and Per in particular for modeling all of this stuff. I find functional programming is really, really useful for doing software simulation. It fits very nicely into that kind of paradigm. I use Data Expects. That it's a package I'm producing, although there's another one called Data Explorer. And I have my front one here is the car insurance pricing, which I'm in the process of looking at now because the code up there is different to what's on this presentation, and I really need to review it because I last worked on that in about 2016, and it really needs an update because I've learned an awful lot more about how to model things and how to build this stuff. So I really need to look at that. If any of you've got any questions, my email address is here. By all means, hit me up. I mean, I'm going to be in the chat as well. I've pretty much used up all my time, which is great. All my talks that I've ever given, including the ones I've given at DataFest before, they are all in data workshops in that GitHub repo. I have a bunch of stuff up there. I give workshops all the time. I give talks. All of that stuff is online. Most of it is in R and R Markdown. There's a couple of others, like I've used SQL, and I think there's one or two Python things up there. Most of my work is done in R, though, and R Markdown. But that's about it.